In the far reaches of the galaxy, a powerful empire known as the Velthari Empire ruled over countless worlds. The Velthari were known for their advanced technology, vast resources, and strict ways. Their laws were ancient, and anyone who broke them faced severe consequences. Princess Calith of the Velthari Empire had always been a troublemaker. She never liked following the rules that her people held so dear. Calith was different. She often asked questions, challenged authority, and refused to follow the ancient traditions that the Velthari Empire had built its power on. Her defiance finally caught up with her. Calith's latest rebellion was the breaking point. She had publicly spoken out against the Council of the Empire, calling their leadership outdated and unfair. Her words were not just dangerous. They were a direct challenge to the Empire itself. The Council, in all their wisdom, decided that she must be punished, but not in the way most would expect. Instead of imprisoning her or banishing her, they decided on something far more humiliating. The Velthari Council made a decision that would shock the galaxy. Calith would be sent to Earth, to a human named Ethan Carter, as a punishment. The humans had no great power or influence in the galaxy. They were small, insignificant in the eyes of the Velthari, and the Council thought that living among them would be the ultimate disgrace for a princess like Calith. But Calith, proud and stubborn, did not see herself as a person who could be punished. She had been raised to be a leader, not to bow down to others. The thought of being sent to Earth, of being placed in the hands of a human, was unbearable. Her father, the Emperor of the Velthari, stood beside her as the decision was announced. He did not understand his daughter's defiance, but he believed that this punishment would be the one that would make her learn respect for their empire. He looked at her with a stern face and said, "Calith, this is the path you have chosen. You will go to Earth and stay with the human. You will learn humility and return only when you have proven yourself worthy." Calith's heart sank. She was being cast aside, but not in the way she expected. She had been a princess her entire life, surrounded by luxury and respect. Now she was about to be sent to a world where she was nothing. She clenched her fists, feeling the heat rise inside her. She would not be humiliated. Calith had been trained in the ways of the Velthari since childhood, and she was determined not to let anyone, especially a human, treat her as less than she was. Meanwhile, on Earth, Ethan Carter was going about his usual life. Ethan was an engineer, not a hero, and certainly not a man of great importance in the grand scheme of things. He lived alone on a small colony on the planet Arcadia 7, working on machinery that helped support the human settlements there. He had no interest in politics or alien affairs. His life was simple. But one day, Ethan received a message that would change everything. It was an official order from the Galactic Council. He was to receive a companion from the Velthari Empire. The message was short and direct. "Ethan Carter, you are hereby assigned to take care of Princess Calith of the Velthari Empire as part of her punishment. She will arrive at your location in 1 week. Provide her with shelter and ensure she remains under your care until further notice. This is a mandatory assignment." Ethan read the message over and over, his eyes growing wider with each line. He was being asked to care for an alien princess. He couldn't believe it. Why him? Ethan didn't know anything about royalty or politics. He just fixed broken machines. Yet here he was, being thrust into a situation far beyond his understanding. The thought of having an alien princess living in his home didn't sit well with him. What was he supposed to do with her? He barely knew how to take care of himself, let alone someone from another world. But there was no arguing with the council. He had no choice. When the day came, Calith arrived on Arcadia 7 in a shuttle. She was escorted off the ship by a group of Velthari soldiers, who made it clear that she was not to be treated as an ordinary person. Calith stood tall, her eyes sharp and defiant, her royal robes flowing behind her like a symbol of her pride. The soldiers led her to Ethan's small workshop, and there they handed her over to him. The moment they left, Calith turned to Ethan with a cold stare. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice full of disdain. and I will not be treated like some common prisoner." Ethan, unsure of what to say or do, only nodded slowly. He had no idea how to handle this situation. But one thing was clear: this would not be a simple task. Caliph looked around the small workshop, unimpressed. The tools on the walls, the worn-out machines scattered across the room, and the piles of mechanical parts seemed far beneath her. She had grown up in the lap of luxury, surrounded by beautiful palaces and advanced technology. Nothing about this human colony looked like it belonged in the same universe as her homeland. Ethan, on the other hand, watched her carefully, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't used to dealing with royalty, let alone an alien princess who clearly didn't want to be here. His first instinct was to offer her something, maybe food or a drink. But when he looked at her, all he could see was the proud defiance in her eyes. She didn't want his help. She didn't want anything from him. "Are you just going to stare at me?" Caliph asked coldly, her arms crossed tightly in front of her. She didn't speak in the soft tones of a princess, but in a sharp, almost harsh voice. Ethan scratched the back of his neck. "I'm not sure what you expect from me." Caliph's eyes narrowed. "What I expect is to be treated with respect. I'm a princess of the Velthari Empire. I belong among my people, not here." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that, but at the same time, he had no idea what to do with a princess. A few days ago, his biggest problem was fixing a broken engine. Now he was stuck with an alien princess who didn't want to be here and made it clear she wouldn't tolerate being treated like a regular person. "Well, I can't exactly send you back to the Empire," Ethan said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just here to make sure you stay safe and, well, comfortable, I guess. You'll be fine." Caliph scoffed. "Safe? Comfortable? You think that's enough for someone like me? I am not some pet to be cared for." Ethan took a deep breath. "I didn't think of you that way. But I don't know what you want me to do." "You will do nothing." Her voice was firm, like she was giving him an order. "I am here only because I have no choice. My presence is a punishment, and I will not allow myself to be treated as anything less than a princess." Her words stung. Ethan hadn't wanted to make her feel like a prisoner, but that's exactly how she saw herself. And who could blame her? She was forced to leave behind everything she knew, thrown into a world where she didn't belong. Ethan couldn't understand what it must have felt like to be in her shoes, but he knew this wasn't going to be easy for either of them. He tried a different approach. "Look, I get it. This is strange. But I've got some work to do around here. If you want, you can stay in the living area. You don't have to do anything, just rest." Caliph stared at him for a moment, her gaze calculating. "Rest? Like a common worker?" "I think not." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I don't expect you to do anything you don't want to. But if you want to stay here, we have to figure something out. You can't just sit here and be angry all day." "I do not need your approval," Caliph said, turning her back to him, and walking toward a chair. She sat down, still stiff and regal, like a queen who had been forced to kneel before a commoner. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, though she refused to admit it. For the next few hours, Ethan tried to keep to his work, but every now and then, he would glance over at Caliph, who sat silently, staring out of the window at the alien landscape of Arcadia 7. He could tell she wasn't looking at the view. Her mind was far away, lost in thoughts that Ethan couldn't begin to understand. After a while, Caliph finally broke the silence. "Tell me, human, what is it like to live like this? To have no empire, no palace?" Ethan paused, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected her to show any curiosity about his life. "It's different, I guess," he said. "I don't have the kind of power you're used to. I just fix things. I keep the colony running. And that's enough for me." Caliph looked at him, a hint of something softer in her eyes now. "And you're content?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Yeah, I am. I don't need much. I've got a roof over my head, a job to do, and the freedom to make my own choices. That's something, right? Caliph was silent for a long time. It wasn't the answer she was expecting, but for some reason, it made her think. Could it be true that someone like Ethan, someone with so little compared to her own wealth and power, could be satisfied with such a simple life? She shook her head, unwilling to entertain the thought. No, it wasn't possible. She had been trained to rule, to lead. This life, this simplicity, was beneath her. She was still a princess, and no matter how much time she spent with this human, she would never forget who she was. Ethan returned to his work, but he noticed something had changed. Caliph hadn't spoken much since their conversation, but she seemed a little less distant. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for them to understand each other. He couldn't be sure yet, but he was willing to try. For now, they were stuck together, two people from vastly different worlds, trying to make the best of a situation neither of them had chosen. The days passed slowly. Ethan and Caliph kept to their separate routines, their interactions limited to brief exchanges about food, shelter, and the basic things Caliph needed to survive on Earth. Ethan never pushed her too hard, respecting her space, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she was still so distant. Caliph barely spoke to him, her eyes filled with the kind of pride that made it clear she felt trapped in a world that wasn't her own. Yet, something was changing. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he began noticing small shifts in Caliph's behavior. One evening, as he worked on a machine in the workshop, he heard a soft voice behind him. "I need something to do," Caliph said, her tone still stiff, but there was no anger in it this time. Ethan turned to find her standing near the doorway, her arms crossed as she looked at the tools and equipment around the room. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to just sit around all day," Caliph explained, her gaze lingering on a broken piece of equipment on the workbench. "I may not be a mechanic, but I'm not some helpless creature either." Ethan blinked, surprised by her willingness to get involved. "Are you sure? I mean, I don't want you to feel like you have to work." Caliph shrugged, her voice softer than before. "I have no interest in being idle. If I'm going to be stuck here, I might as well learn something useful." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had expected Caliph to continue avoiding any sort of interaction with his work, but here she was, asking to help. Maybe she was starting to see that she couldn't remain a princess forever, not here on Earth, not in a small human colony. "Well, I could use some help fixing this," Ethan said, motioning to the broken piece of equipment on the table. "It's a bit tricky, but if you're interested, I could show you how to get started." Caliph hesitated for a moment, but then walked over to the workbench, eyeing the machine carefully. "I'm no expert in machines, but I know how to work with my hands. I've been trained to repair my own equipment back on Velfar," she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Well, this is different from what you're used to, but I'm sure you'll get the hang of it." Caliph took the tools Ethan handed her with a confident grip. The way she moved, the way she focused, made it clear that even though she wasn't used to this kind of work, she had the drive to learn. Ethan watched as she carefully examined the machine, her brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't realize it at first, but he was starting to see a different side of Caliph, the side that was willing to try something new, even if it wasn't part of her royal life. Hours passed as they worked together, fixing the machine bit by bit. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect that had begun to grow. Caliph didn't say much, but every now and then, she'd ask a question or make a suggestion about the repair. Ethan was impressed by how quickly she caught on, and he started to feel a sense of pride in her progress. "I didn't think you'd be interested in fixing machines," Ethan said after a while, smiling at her. Caliph looked up, her eyes softening for the first time since she'd arrived. "I wasn't, at first, but I can't keep hiding from reality. I have to adapt to this place." Ethan nodded. "I get it. It's not easy being in a place where everything is different, where nothing feels familiar. But you're doing well." Caliph looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You think so?" "I do. he said simply. "I'm impressed." There was a pause before Caliph spoke again, her voice quieter. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this. It's strange, but I can't deny that it feels good. To fix something, to be useful." Ethan smiled. Sometimes, the simplest tasks can be the most rewarding. Caliph glanced down at the machine they had just fixed, a small sense of pride growing in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to feel this way about something so mundane. But as she looked at the working equipment, she realized that this was the first time since her arrival that she didn't feel completely lost. "I still don't belong here," she said after a moment, her voice returning to the distant tone it had held before. "I am a princess. I should be ruling, not fixing machines with a human." Ethan nodded, understanding. "I know. But maybe you're starting to see that there's more to life than just power and rules. Maybe there's something to be said for the little things." Caliph didn't answer right away. She simply stood there, looking at the machine, then back at Ethan. She had come to Earth expecting to be humiliated, expecting to lose everything she held dear. And yet, here she was, learning to fix machines with a human she had once thought beneath her. It wasn't what she had imagined, but maybe, just maybe, it was starting to make sense. As the evening wore on, Ethan and Caliph continued to work side by side. The once stiff air between them had started to shift, replaced by a new understanding. Neither of them knew where this journey would take them, but for the first time since Caliph's arrival, the future didn't seem quite as uncertain. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet routine between Ethan and Caliph continued. Their shared work in the workshop became a normal part of their days, and though Caliph remained a bit distant, there was no longer the cold wall of silence that had once separated them. Now, there was a kind of mutual understanding, silent but real. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the distant hills, Ethan walked into the small kitchen to find Caliph already sitting at the table. She was looking out the window, her eyes distant as usual, but her posture was relaxed. It was a small change, but to Ethan it was significant. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice light. "You're up early." Caliph didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a slow breath and then nodded. "I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking." Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious. "About what?" Caliph hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "About everything. About being here. About what comes next." Ethan didn't push. He understood that it was a sensitive topic. Caliph was a stranger to this world, and everything she knew had been taken from her. Her royal status, her people, her planet, all of it seemed far away now, and she was stuck in a place that felt like an endless waiting room. "I can't imagine how difficult it must be for you," Ethan said softly. "Everything's different here." She gave a small nod. "It is, and it's unsettling. But I've come to realize something, Ethan." Caliph finally met his eyes. "Maybe I've been fighting against this place, fighting against you even, but it's not helping. I have to stop thinking like I'm going to wake up and return to my old life. It's gone." Ethan's heart went out to her. He knew that her loss was something she would carry forever, but maybe now she was beginning to accept that Earth wasn't the enemy. It was just a place, a strange new place that offered its own kind of opportunities. "You're right," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you have to be alone in it. I'll help however I can." Caliph smiled faintly, the first real smile Ethan had seen from her in a long time. It wasn't a large, joyful smile, but it was a start. Slowly, the icy walls around her heart were beginning to crack. After breakfast, Ethan suggested they take a walk outside. He thought it might do them both some good. The world outside their home was vast and beautiful, filled with rolling fields and tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. Caliph had been reluctant to leave the house much at all, but today there was a subtle shift in her. She agreed without protest, and together they stepped outside. The cool breeze swept across the fields, and Calith's long hair swayed gently behind her. As they walked, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was companionable, even peaceful. They weren't speaking much, but it felt like they were finally in the same space, mentally and emotionally. After a while, Calith spoke, her voice low. "I never thought I'd walk through a world like this. It's simple." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the observation. "Simple?" She nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon. Back home, life was always busy, always noisy, full of politics and endless responsibilities. There were people watching, waiting for me to make the right decision. But here, there's just quiet. It's different. It's peaceful. Ethan smiled. "It's a good kind of peaceful, though, right?" Calith glanced at him, and for a moment, the mask of the cold princess slipped away. There was vulnerability in her eyes, an openness that she hadn't allowed herself to show before. "It is," she admitted. "It's just, I don't know how to live like this. I've never been free before." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "You don't have to figure it out all at once. Just take it one step at a time. We don't have to rush." Calith studied him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the struggle in her expression. She had been trained to be a ruler, to think of the bigger picture, to always have a plan. But here, in this quiet world with Ethan, there was no need for grand strategies. She could just be herself, with no expectations, no crown, and no one waiting for her to make the perfect decision. "You're right," Calith said, her voice soft. "I've been so focused on what I've lost that I haven't allowed myself to think about what I still have, what I could have here." Ethan smiled warmly. "Exactly. There's no rush. And maybe you don't need to figure out the whole world right now. Just live here. Live with me as friends. And who knows, maybe you'll find what you're looking for." Calith looked down at her hands for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she felt a flicker of hope, like there could be a future here, one that wasn't entirely defined by her past. They continued their walk, their steps now in sync as they wandered through the fields. Calith felt something shift in her heart, a small, delicate thing, but a thing nonetheless. She wasn't alone here. And maybe, just maybe, Earth had something more to offer than she had ever imagined. The days continued to pass, and with each one, Ethan and Calith found themselves falling into a rhythm, like two instruments learning to play in harmony. There were still awkward moments, of course. Calith, despite her acceptance of Earth, still held on to the old habits and thoughts from her life as a royal. But Ethan had learned not to push her too hard. Instead, he offered her the space she needed, never forcing anything. One afternoon, while Ethan worked on a small project in the workshop, Calith wandered outside to explore. The sun was warm, and the air smelled fresh, so different from the cool, sterile air of the ship she had once called home. She had grown used to the quiet, but it was still a strange kind of peace. It felt like the world here was holding its breath, waiting for her to decide what kind of future she wanted. She had never been given that choice before. As the princess of her people, her life had been determined by duties and expectations. But now, here on Earth, she had the power to choose, something she had never experienced until now. As she walked through the fields, her thoughts wandered. She thought of the life she had left behind, the palace, the people who once adored her, and the responsibilities that had been thrust upon her. Then her mind shifted to Ethan. At first, she had resented being given to him, punished by her people. He was just a human, someone who had no knowledge of her world or her struggles. But in the time they had spent together, she had come to see something different in him. Ethan was patient, kind. He never demanded anything from her, yet he was always there when she needed him. He had shown her that not all people were like those she had known before, self-serving and driven by power. Ethan didn't care about her status, her past. He cared about who she was now. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice calling her name. "Calith." She turned to see Ethan walking toward her, a friendly smile on his face. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Caliph nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Thinking about what?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "About everything. About my life. About why I'm here. About what happens next." Ethan walked closer, offering her a hand, and she took it without thinking. It felt natural, comfortable. "That's a lot to think about," he said, his voice gentle. "But you don't have to figure it all out right now." Caliph glanced at him, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about living in the moment. Maybe I've been too focused on the past." Ethan smiled softly. "It's easy to get stuck in the past, but you don't have to carry it with you. You've got a whole new life ahead of you, and I'll be here, helping you every step of the way." Caliph looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," she said quietly. "I don't know if I could have gotten this far without you." Ethan shrugged, his usual easygoing smile on his face. "You would have figured it out, but I'm glad I could be here with you." They stood there for a moment, holding hands, the weight of their shared silence speaking volumes. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. But it was there, a connection that went deeper than just two people helping each other through difficult times. Caliph felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't had in so long. Hope. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, but it felt good. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ethan suggested they head back inside. "How about we make dinner?" he asked. "I'm pretty sure we're both getting hungry." Caliph nodded, feeling a small smile tug at her lips. "That sounds nice." As they walked back to the house, Caliph realized something important. She had arrived on Earth feeling lost, abandoned, and unsure of her future. But now, with each passing day, she was starting to see a future, a life that she could build for herself, not as a princess, but as a person. And that person was slowly but surely becoming a part of Ethan's world. As time passed, Caliph began to feel something inside her shift. The uncertainty that had clung to her heart like a heavy fog started to lift. Every day, there was something new, something small that made her feel more at home on Earth. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. She was learning to embrace the peaceful, quiet life that Ethan had shown her, and slowly, she was finding herself in it. One morning, as she sat by the window looking out at the fields, Caliph felt a deep sense of gratitude for the simplicity of life here. It was a far cry from the cold, demanding life she had once known, and though it was not what she had expected, it was a life she could learn to love. Ethan came in from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey, Caliph," he said, his voice light. "How about we go into town today? I thought it might be nice to see a bit more of the world outside this little spot." Caliph turned her head, surprised by the suggestion. "Town? I've never been. What's it like?" Ethan shrugged. "It's small, but there's a market, some shops, and a cafe. It's the kind of place where people know each other, so it feels more like a community than just a place to pass through." Caliph thought for a moment. She had spent so long in isolation, focused on what she had lost, that she hadn't considered exploring the world around her. Maybe it was time to start experiencing it, not as a stranger, but as someone who could belong. "I think that sounds good," she said with a small smile. "I'd like to see it." Ethan grinned, happy to see her enthusiasm. "Great, we'll leave in a bit." Later that morning, they drove into town in Ethan's truck. The road was smooth, and the landscape rolled by like a scene from a painting. The small town wasn't far from their home, but to Caliph, it felt like a different world. The buildings were cozy and simple, and there were people walking along the streets, exchanging greetings and smiles. It was all so peaceful, so unlike the cold, bustling palace she had once known. When they arrived at the market, Caliph's eyes widened. The area was full of fresh produce, colorful flowers, and handmade goods. People moved about, chatting and laughing, while the scent of fresh bread and herbs filled the air. "This is amazing," Caliph murmured, taking in everything around her. Ethan chuckled. "It's not much, but it's home. Let's take a look around." They wandered through the market together, stopping at different stalls. Caliph was amazed by the variety of fruits and vegetables she had never seen before. She picked up a small orange fruit and studied it curiously. "What is this?" "That's an apricot," Ethan said. "It's sweet and juicy. Want to try one?" Caliph hesitated, then nodded. She took a bite, her face lighting up as the sweetness filled her mouth. "It's delicious." Ethan laughed. "I knew you'd like it. There's a lot more like that here. Fresh food, handmade crafts, and local goods. You can find almost anything if you know where to look." They continued to stroll through the market, and Caliph felt a growing sense of peace. The people here were kind, smiling at her as she passed. They didn't treat her like an outsider, like the royalty she used to be. They simply treated her like another person, another visitor to their world. And that, Caliph realized, was the greatest gift of all. As they made their way toward the cafe, Caliph noticed a small group of children playing nearby. They were laughing and chasing each other, their carefree joy filling the air. For the first time in what felt like ages, Caliph felt a pang of longing for the kind of freedom they had. The kind of freedom she had once taken for granted. "You ever think about what it would be like to just live like that?" she asked, nodding toward the children. Ethan looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "I think everyone dreams of a simpler life, at least sometimes. But it's not always easy to find it." Caliph nodded, her gaze still on the children. "I used to dream about a life where I could just live without worrying about others, without having to carry the weight of a crown or the expectations of my people." Ethan smiled softly. "I think you've found that life now. Here, it's not the life you thought you'd have, but maybe it's the one you were meant to find." She turned to him, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't expected. Gratitude. It was so simple, so small, but it felt like the foundation for something much bigger. Maybe she could find her way here, in this quiet town, with this kind man by her side. Maybe, just maybe, her future didn't have to be defined by what she had lost, but by what she could still find. As they sat down at the cafe, Caliph took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. She wasn't sure where her journey would lead, but for the first time, she felt like she had a choice in the matter. And that, she realized, was all she really needed. As the weeks passed, Caliph's life on Earth continued to transform. Each day felt like a new discovery, not just of the world around her, but of herself. With Ethan by her side, she was beginning to understand that her past didn't have to define her future. She didn't need to be the princess who was always in control, always expected to live up to everyone else's standards. Instead, she could simply be herself, someone who was still learning, still growing. One evening, after a long day of working in the garden, Caliph and Ethan sat outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, and the air was calm. They were quiet, enjoying the peace of the moment. "You know," Ethan said after a long silence, "I never really imagined my life would end up like this." Caliph turned to him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. "I mean, I never thought I'd be living with an alien princess, helping her adjust to Earth. I thought my life was set in a routine. But then you came along." Caliph chuckled softly, her eyes shining with amusement. "I think I've changed more than just your routine." Ethan laughed too, the sound light and carefree. "That's an understatement. You've changed everything. But honestly, I wouldn't want it any other way." Caliph felt a warmth spread through her at his words. There was no denying it. She had come to care deeply for Ethan. But it wasn't just about gratitude or even friendship. There was something more, something unspoken that had been growing between them. A connection that felt deeper than anything she had ever known. She took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts into words. Ethan, I'm not the same person I was when I first arrived here. I don't feel like I'm just living for the sake of living anymore. I feel like I have a purpose now. And it's because of you. Ethan looked at her with soft eyes, his expression sincere. Caliph, you've always had a purpose. I just helped you see it. You don't need a title or a crown to matter. You matter because of who you are. Her heart fluttered at his words, and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. I'm still learning how to live here, how to be free, but I'm starting to understand what it means. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his voice full of warmth. You're doing great. You've come so far already. And as long as you want, I'll be here to help you every step of the way. The stars began to appear in the sky above them, one by one, until the whole sky was dotted with twinkling lights. Caliph looked up at the night sky, her thoughts drifting. She had been so focused on the past, on what she had lost, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to look forward. But now, with Ethan by her side, she could finally see a future filled with possibilities. She turned back to him, her voice soft, but filled with resolve. Ethan, I've been thinking. I know I've been through a lot, and I'm still not sure where everything is headed, but I want to make my own way here. I want to help people, to do something that matters. I don't want to be stuck in the past anymore. Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with pride. You already matter, Caliph, and you're going to do amazing things, I'm sure of it. For the first time in a long while, Caliph felt something inside her settle. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover, but she was no longer afraid of what the future held. She didn't need to have all the answers right away. What mattered was that she was moving forward, and she wasn't alone. Ethan leaned over and gently kissed her forehead, a simple gesture filled with kindness and understanding. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Caliph closed her eyes, feeling the peace that came with that promise. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. It would be hers to shape. And with Ethan at her side, she felt ready for anything. The next morning, Caliph woke up with a sense of excitement, knowing that her journey was far from over. The world was full of opportunities, and for the first time in a long while, she was eager to embrace them. There were no more chains holding her back, no more expectations from others. She was free. And for the first time, she was living for herself.